Good evening and welcome to all of you. And for those of you who are watching from the Northern Hemisphere, that includes, of course, our speakers, a very good morning. My name is Frédéric Grare, and I will moderating this webinar. Today's conversation is the first in a new series launched by the ANU National Security College and entitled Indo-Pacific Partners. And over the next few months, Indo-Pacific Partners will examine how Australia and France do, will, or could address issues of common interest in the Indo-Pacific. The recent streak of high-level visits between the two countries clearly signal a willingness to set the relationship between Australia and France on a new upward, if more modest, trajectory. Yet, in many ways, this trajectory is still to be defined. Strategic considerations are still important, if not predominant, but the military component has diminished. Cooperation is no longer about the co-development of big military assets, but about the joint management together as well as with other regional actors of a space where a priori non-strategic issues may have potential major strategic impacts. Australia and France agree in principle on the nature of the problems they are jointly faced with in the Indo-Pacific, but they diverge on many of the specifics which define today the terms of coalition building across the region. The task of the two countries is therefore to define bilaterally compatible responses to the regional needs of the entire region. In each domain of cooperation, strategic convergence is likely to be contradicted by tactical consideration as well as structural constraint. And it goes without saying that domestic consideration of all kinds do not always make the task any easier. So to initiate the conversation, we have asked three eminent speakers, diplomats and academics, to give us their views about the future of the relationship. It is my privilege to introduce Mr. Christian Lechervy, who has held several ambassadorial postings and of particular relevance to the conversation of this evening, has been ambassador of France to the Pacific Community and the Pacific Regional Environment Program. He's also a fine academic currently working in parallel with the Institut Français de Relations Internationales. Mrs. Denise Fisher is also a diplomat with a long and distinguished career, and to the relevance of this conversation as held posting directly dealing with the French territories in the Pacific. She is an academic as well, currently visiting fellow at the ANU Center for European Studies, and has written extensively on France in the Pacific. And finally, Mrs. Anne McNaughton, who will be our discussant this evening, and who is the director of the ANU Center for European Studies. Good evening to all of you. Good morning, sorry, for all of you, and good morning to you, or good evening, sorry, to you, Anne. Each of the speakers will speak now for about 15 minutes, present their views, and we will then open a larger debate. So let's start with you, Ambassador Lechervy. How does France look at the future of its relationship with Australia?
Thanks, Frédéric. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your invitations and your confidence to open a somewhat sensitive debate. I'm not going to detail the Australia-France roadmap agreed at the end of last year. You can see and read it on the MOFAB website, the French one or the Australian, but analyze the question that the Indo-Pacific concept may raise for our bilateral relations. I think we can say that each state that adopts the Indo-Pacific concept, IP, has entered Indo-Pacificity, if you pardon the neologism, on its own, with own understanding of the geography, political military objective, and its modus operandi. Basically, the IP is a cobbled together concept. It needs to be discussed to offer synergy to states that adopt it for more or less similar purposes. Adopting the same narrative doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same goals, including when the two states have no doubt about their affinity based on shared democratic values, past war alliance, a common attachment to democracy, multilateralism, international order governed by the rules. The concept original promoter, Japan, India, US, Australia, and France, have at best sought to implement is through unilateral framework comprising of very, very limited numbers of partners, always fewer than 5. Quad, AUKUS, the France, UAE, India, France, Australia, India, tripod. The President Macron even floats the idea of an IP axis built around very, very few key partners, including Canberra. However, 2 states, one in Europe, another one in Southeast Asia, have succeeded in turning the Indo-Pacific into a narrative shared by a wider grouping of states, or even initiating a new intergovernmental club. France has convinced its EU partners to join us in giving the EU not only an Indo-Pacific strategy, but also a permanent platform for dialogue with an annual ad hoc meeting of foreign ministers without China and without the US. The 3rd session of this meeting just takes place in Brussels. All in all, Indonesia has achieved the same result for ASEAN. Does Australia want to contribute to the creation of an Indo-Pacific platform with the Europeans and or ASEAN partners along the line already outlined? The second challenge is convince more partners to adopt an IP approach. But for what? On closer examination, the IP concept is supported on the international stage by fewer than 50 countries, less than the sum of all states bordering the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. We still have some way to go in convincing people of the concept usefulness. After having aroused perplexity and curiosity, is now causing concern. The mute hostility is met here, and there is a becoming more explicit, especially in the Pacific regions. Is the concept there to build tomorrow world around the planet new economic center of gravity, or to frame the era of the great new powered games? It's not certain that all Western players will answer the question on the same way. There is themselves, therefore, a risk of dissonance in the Indo-Pacific object, not only on the planetary scale, but also on the regional one. We are at the point in the concept history where it may be experiencing more major difference of opinion between its original promoter and among Westerners. The NATO summit in Washington next July will perhaps be one of such occasions when the term of association of the 4AP will be discussed. Given the enduring nature of the Russian threat, NATO cannot abandon its regional mission in favor of future of international organizations. The fact that the security architecture in the Asia-Pacific regions has been deficient since the demise of Seattle in the late 1970s, and the future of Euro-Asian security challenge are increasingly interlinked, is no reason to change the European nature of the Atlantic Alliance. The third challenge is the multi-alignment. Faced with a deepening Sino-American confrontation, France is not looking for equidistance. We know who is an ally and who is a systemic rival. In the Indo-Pacific, most states don't want to have to choose one over the others. In Asia and the Pacific, people want to take full advantage of a multi-cardinality. The growing numbers of dialogue and development partners in ASEAN and Pacific Island Forum is an example of this evolution. As allies of the US, how we will respond to the desire of many of our Asian and Oceanian partners for a multi-cardinal approach. For nearly 80 years, we have been able to make Western affinities work in Asia and the Pacific, but the world is reordering itself with a greater number of players. Let's be careful then not to take the easy way out and form Western club to meet the challenge on today and tomorrow. This is particularly urgent in the Pacific, where the US, France, and in lesser extent, UK are re-engaging. This is a highly topical issue for the Partners in the Blue Pacific, PBP, club, which include 6 former totalitarian powers in the Pacific, among 8 members and partners. Beware of easy solutions that are nothing more than a dangerous entre-soi. The Indo-Pacific and the sub-regional pillar that support it must be an expression of open multilateralism and inclusive multilateralism. This action is essential at the time of China is seeking to organize an order that challenges the one born of the Second World War. This is why the partnership approach we propose emphasizes the need to protect the sovereignty of individual states. In this context, the sharing of strategic analysis will be essential. This is why it's a good idea for the two countries promoting an Indo-Pacific approach, such as France and Australia, to discuss the IP object and its operationalization as openly as possible in all possible forms of bilateral discussions. In this perspective, the decision to launch an Australian-France Indo-Pacific Studies Program and a Pacific Shared Knowledge Initiative are particularly welcome since they're implemented on a long term. We need to stop up our political military exchange, not least because France and Australia are bi-oceanic and take this identity for granted. This geographic bicephalus is very rare among the state of the IP. How can we build on this singularity to develop a common approach to the Indo-Pacific and its regional subdivision, to which our two countries belong, IORA, ASEAN, Pacific Island Forum? There is no doubt that the energy transitions, the climate, and the resilience of the IP will be at the heart of our future cooperation. This call for a methodical joint approach to the IP with a view of medium and long-term interactions. The contract of trust established around the launch of the conventional powered submarine program has been broken, setting up back several years. AUKUS and its submarine, non-submarine component will probably not facilitate a return to structuring armament cooperation project between France and Australia. The success of improving mutual access to military installations and the program of joint supply of ammunition to Ukraine will be even more important. The evolution of public opinion in Europe, but also in the US, on the new free trade agreement is not going to make it any easier to write the economic chapter of Indo-Pacific strategy. We know, however, that the economic dimension of our IP is still insufficiently developed. We can say that the IP concept is not truly endorsed by the business community, yet our interlocutors in Asia and the Pacific are primarily concerned with boosting their growth and generating new jobs. There is a fear that regional integration project will be transformed from an indispensable factor in the prosperity of states and their people into a tool of geopolitical competition. How can we ensure that the IP concept is soothing and not an additional factor of anxiety? Support for strategic infrastructure projects must be examined, not such from a development perspective, but from a regional scaling perspective. Cooperation on critical mineral will be just as essential. We will have to think about economic security, the control of value chain on the scale of the regions. It's a challenge, but the Indo-Pacific concept needs to be de-geopoliticized. The first topic for discussion is the very nature of the Indo-Pacific concept. That being the Pacific object relate to the reordering of the world order, especially the economic one, as a result of the rise in power of India and China? Or does it relate first and foremost to geopolitics and the need to manage the confrontations between the US and China? The nature of interstate cooperation with the region state will differ depending on which approach is adopted. In the first case, the aim is to build reflexive, mutually beneficial cooperation with as many partners as possible, large or smaller. In the other case, the aim will be to prioritize partnerships and build multilateralism alliance, which may be extensive. There is, I think, a desire into there is a desire on our side to integrate in a wider space, but also in each of its subregional dimensions, from Indian Oceania, the southwestern coast of the Indian Ocean and East African coastline, to the western coast of America. Let's not forget that France borders Mexico in the North Pacific with Clipperton Island and share a strong geographical and cultural proximity with Chile in the southern hemisphere through Rapa Nui. The IP is an opportunity to take a different geographical look at France. By the way, I'd like to point out that France has maritime border with 3 of the 4 countries in the Anglosphere. Australia with the Coral Sea and the Kerguelen, New Zealand via its proximity to the Cook Island and French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna and Tokelau, and the United Kingdom with Pitcairn Island. The geography partially determined the French IP strategy, but also the P pillar and the importance attached to the maritime issue. We need to remember that half of the 32 states which France have maritime borders are in the IP regions. 8% of the UN member states border France in the Indo-Pacific regions. Of all the countries in the IP, France has by the largest numbers of neighbors, 16 in all, including 5 in the Indian Ocean and 11 in the Pacific. And this neighborhood are a source of interactions in the field of security and development. All of France in the Pacific region are maritime, making an archipelago state. The aqueous reality can become a constitutive dimensions of the Franco-Australian, but also France-New Zealand partnership. France sees itself as a Pacific state, as a state, you can say European state in the Pacific, and Indian Ocean state, a state in the Indian Ocean. And denying 4 axiom can only complicate relations with Paris. This approach may be judged from the outside or even time to time from inside as erroneous, inappropriate, or outdated, but the fact remains that it lies at the heart of the French IP political narrative. In the Indo-Pacific, France is polysemous. It's a player from within and from without. This distinguishes it from its European partners and Australia. For Europeans, the IP is a way of deprovincializations themselves, or standing at the heart of the new globalization of the Asian 21st century. For Australia, it's an opportunity to assert its Asian and Oceanian proximity. If for Canberra, the IP enables us to think and act with contiguous world, for Europeans, the concept will require us to take into account the pace that lead to it, starting with Euro-Mediterranean area and a region in between. the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor take us mesa voce down this road. The effect of this new link is to expand the IP area westward and involve more EU players. From my point of view, one gets the impression that at the antipode end of the spectrum, the IP space is shrinking around the security facing Taiwan. This is not at least the paradox, given that the IP concept was designed by the Americans to take better account of India in the Asia-Pacific regions. What effect that these double polarizations have on our two countries? How far west will Australia expand its Indo-Pacific actions? And there is the influence of Taiwan urgency and the US growing concern in the Pacific. Will Australia have to spell out its Indo-Pacific policy more explicitly with a lowercase I and a capital P? Will this reduce or widen the scope of interactions between Australia and France? I will stop my list of questions and comment here, but building a Franco-Australian partnership in the Indo-Pacific require in a depth understanding of what is possible, what the other are, how they were multiplying their links within the IP area and beyond the mega regions. Thanks for your intentions and thanks for your invitations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lechervy. Let's turn to you now, Mrs. Fisher. You have heard the comment of Ambassador Lechervy. I mean, what is the view from Australia?
Well, I'm going to talk, thank you very much for a start of it, for including me today. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on the France-Australia relationship and on France's Indo-Pacific vision, and then look at some areas of uncertainty and some areas of opportunity or challenge. But at the outset, it's important to say that France is a natural ally in the Indo-Pacific. There's no question about that. In terms of the bilateral relationship with Australia, it's a unique relationship. It is one of our oldest diplomatic relationships, France establishing its consulate in Australia in 1842. And of course, we all know that La Pérouse's ship only arrived 2 weeks after the British in Botany Bay. But it is firmly anchored in the Pacific. Our relationship with France is firmly anchored in the Pacific. And the third distinction for our relationship with France is that we are actually neighbours, as Monsieur Lechervy said. We are neighbours in the Pacific. We are not just relating to a European partner. And more importantly, we're neighbours through France's presence in New Caledonia, which is a strategically important place for us. It's our closest neighbour off the coast of Brisbane. It straddles important trade routes through to Sydney and our major capital cities. And most as recently as the Second World War, it was a proven strategic outpost, very critical strategic post for both France and Australia, where Australia was physically delivered the de Gaulle governor in the early years of the war, paving the way for the Americans to come in and set up their Pacific headquarters there, from which they launched the Battle of the Coral Sea, critical to Australia's defence, the keystone of our foreign policy right to this day. So our earliest contacts and right through our relationship has been one of strategic interest, defence, trade and the Pacific. So we're well placed to collaborate in this concept of the Indo-Pacific. And of course, the Australia-France roadmap Christian referred to is the latest of a series of strategic reviews of our relationship, papers agreements in 2007, refined in 2012, and now the latest one signed by our foreign ministers at the end of last year. I see two major operating factors in the relationship. The partner that we, Australia, see in the region on a day-to-day basis is actually based on the other side of the world. in the European capital with major leadership commitments there, which are not always consistent with ours, but which is something we must appreciate and take account of. For its part, I think France may not always take account of the fact that we are a Pacific Island Forum member, that our major role is the major role for us of the US alliance, of our role in that alliance, which is the cornerstone of our foreign and strategic policy, and that we, as a member of the Pacific Island Forum, defend Pacific Islands' interests and the networks that have been established. The way these two aspects can bump into each other sometimes has been manifest in the relationship. We know, of course, the bad old days of the nuclear testing in the Pacific, the handling of decolonization demands by France, which was firmly opposed by Pacific Island countries, and the effort that they went to successful to get France to change its policies. On the trade side, we also saw that France, as a leading EU member, broke down the Asia, Caribbean, Pacific trade preferences, allowing access for the small islands to European markets, and instead replaced it with a system of bilateral trade agreements, which some can say was inconsistent with some of the networks which had been established in the region. And of course, there's AUKUS, the rupture that occurred over the decision by France to suspend a contract with France, for Australia to suspend a contract with France and to move to a different arrangement with AUKUS. I think both of us need to learn from these experiences and to be very careful about ensuring that things like this can be managed very well in the future. A couple of things about France's Indo-Pacific vision, and Christian has alluded to it already. It was conceived and articulated from Noumea and Papeete with the sovereignty of France in both oceans in mind. As Christian says, France is in both oceans by virtue of its territories in those oceans. But strategically for France, I think this has become, the Indo-Pacific concept has become more pointy at the Western Indian Ocean end, as we've seen the war in the Ukraine deprive Europe and France of its original source of energies from Russia, seeks more alternative sources, including from India. Then with the war between Israel and Hamas, the threat to the Suez Canal, that vital pathway for France, for most of us, so that France has got some presence in the northwestern Indian Ocean, and perhaps this can lead to some complementarities in the Indian Ocean with Australia. I was very pleased to see when Minister Colonna was in Australia at the end of last year that she specifically talked about, and Christian has also articulated, the fact that France is not just in the Pacific, it is of the Pacific. It is one of us, it has territory in the Pacific. But this also means that France, this major European power, needs to reconsider how it adjusts to the fact of it having neighbours in the Pacific, that it is a neighbour, it is our neighbour. And it needs to consider its regional neighbours the same way it would consider its European neighbours back on the metropolitan front. Coming then to some areas of uncertainty, areas where there might be challenges. France cannot succeed in its projection as an Indo-Pacific power without the support of its Pacific neighbours. And I'd like to say a couple of things about the island countries and a couple of things about Australia. An important ingredient for France's Indo-Pacific vision will be its handling of independence movements in both French Polynesia and New Caledonia. Christian has said it, its whole basis, France's presence in the Pacific, is based on its presence in its territories. This is something that regional countries historically care about and monitor very closely. Only as recently as 2013, a number of Pacific Island countries succeeded in having the UN endorse French Polynesia as a non-self-governing territory with the United Nations over France's deep opposition. And so far, regional leaders have been less than impressed with France's management of the very last phase, after wonderful management for 30 years, the final little phase of the Noumea Accord implementation, a third supposedly final referendum on independence, and their report to their leaders last year expressed legitimate concern about this. So they're continuing to monitor, but continuing to be concerned about those things. Secondly, as I've alluded to, trade access. I think there is some expectation that France will behave as a neighbour in the region, not just securing more access for European markets and France's markets, but also for securing access to the markets in these wealthy territories, French Polynesia and New Caledonia. Especially, you know, it's the way in which it's handled the EU management. I think France's role in bringing the EU more deeply into the Indian Ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, and one would hope the Indian Ocean in future, has been very much valued by regional partners, and there's no doubt about that. But perhaps it could have been managed a little bit differently. The Pacific Forum countries and Australia have worked very hard over many decades to establish a network of collective organizations. Why? Because each Pacific Island country has a very small bureaucracy with limited capacity. There is a need to prevent duplication, to prevent overburdening of some of these governments with constant, a lot of bureaucracy and things that Europeans are very used to, but that Pacific Islanders maybe less so. This has been a huge investment by Australia. And so the shift to bilateral treaties was not very helpful, to be very frank. And of course, the next country that came in and did it was China. And so we have to think about, and Christian has written a great paper on the Pacific Island Forum and the multilateral bodies in the Pacific. But as he pointed out, the most successes were when there was a multilateral, more of an organized network of responses rather than bilateral. So I think there needs to be some attention to that. Let's move to Australia very briefly. How disappointing. The latest strategic review of Australia 2023, no mention of France. Where is France in the strategic review? There was none in 2019. Ms. Wong did mention France when she was in Perth and the invaluable contribution that we made with France in the Indian Ocean when she was at an Indian Ocean conference. What a mistake. I can only assume it was a mistake. It was an oversight. But that needs to be redressed. It should be automatic. It should be reflexive that we see France as our strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific. The kerfuffle over AUKUS. Well, I think there are many views about that. It was a decision gate point. There had been many delays. There had been some cultural problems, I think, with the way in which our French client treated us as the employer. And I think the reaction, causing the Prime Minister a liar and so on, didn't help matters very much. But I think also there's room for a better understanding of just how primary our relationship with the United States is in our region, where we are surrounded by countries which far outnumber us in military personnel and in numbers, but where our edge is the technological edge. And I would have thought France, as a major strategic ally, could appreciate the importance for Australia to have its Australian friend at the cutting edge of technology in partnership with others. I do think also that there's a risk. Meg Taylor has written about it very recently, Dame Meg Taylor. If we don't get our act together, Pacific countries, island countries will withdraw into a caucus of their own, excluding external partners. Meg Taylor has warned about this. And I think to come to another point, that France is projecting the way France projects its strategic interests can make regional countries uncomfortable. It seems to project itself quite explicitly as an alternative in the region to China and the US. This, I think, makes Australian officials uncomfortable. Is France saying that China is the same as the United States? Where does it present the positioning for partnerships in our Pacific region? So I think Christian touched on some of this, and I think how do we find ways to smooth that over a little bit more? Just as Australia needs to consider the other pulls on France, I think there is much more scope for France to understand what the pulls are on Australia. And I think that the role of Australia as the Western ally, leading Western ally, needs to be carefully understood. I think, for example, I see a lot of academic work on Indo-Pacific, including a wonderful paper by the Asia-Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue mid last year. Fabulous paper. Thanks, Frédéric. For France which is always about France contributing more to the region. But I think France needs to understand, we are here, we've got all of our borders are in the Indo-Pacific, the bulk of our defence personnel equipment are here. France needs Australia to shore up its strategic interests in this part of the world, there is no doubt. And Australia should not minimise this strategic advantage and perhaps leverage a bit, particularly, I think, on the EU FTA. I think there's more scope there. If France wants to be a neighbour and a friend, maybe it needs to help an agreement be concluded with the EU and Australia. Scope for considerable more cooperation. I've already mentioned France's emphasis in the Northwest Indian Ocean, which is very complementary to what our capacities might be, that's for sure. But I do think France we both should take a lot of inspiration from Mr. Albanese's response to the strategic reviews recommendations. He identified a number of areas where I think France can play a major role. Boosting capacity, increasing our domestic munitions production, expanding the use of high technology, especially in industry cooperation, deepening defence relationships, and of course the whole review was very emphasised on maritime security. I think there are many areas there where we have room for cooperating more with France, particularly in the Indo-Pacific concept. So I'll just leave it there for discussion to start.
Thank you very much, Denise Fisher. It is a very interesting review, which I'm sure will call for a lot of comments later on in the discussion. And it will be in particular interesting to discuss the reality of the terms of exchange with the Pacific country. Let's turn now to Anne McNaughton. You're the discussant tonight. You have heard our two speakers. What are your reactions vis-a-vis the position of the two countries?
Thank you very much, Frédéric, and thank you, Christian and Denise, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I think there are a lot of similarities and differences. As a good comparative lawyer, I would begin with that anyway. I think the common thread to take from the contributions of both is, first of all, that there is, I would like to think, a codependent relationship of Australia and France in the region, both the Indo and the Pacific regions. As Christian pointed out, this idea of an Indo-Pacific is a new one, and we've seen literature. The term itself came around perhaps in 2013, so it's a little over 10 years old. We do have other states that have their own Indo-Pacific strategies. It is a term, something of the imagination perhaps, definitely a term of art that is taking shape. I think at its most basic level, it is helpful to understand it in that geographical way, that it transverses both of those oceans. And I think this is important, particularly from the Australian point of view, because we do straddle, our continent straddles, and we bridge these two areas, and increasingly the developments that are happening both around Africa and also in the maritime areas in the Indian Ocean are should be exciting as much engagement and interest in Australia as that which happens in the Pacific. Secondly, I would say that what I think is lacking both in the Australian context and in the French and European context is a sufficient understanding and awareness of the importance of the EU and the embeddedness of its member states in that structure. Too often I read material that suggests that the EU is a regional organisation such as ASEAN, such as other arrangements. And it's much more than that. It is a legal order. It's much more integrated. And as a consequence, it is really important for us to understand that Australia engaging with France, in this instance in particular, but also with other member states, is undertaken in the context of each of those states being integral members, of course, of the EU. And what this brings with it, we were talking about, and I think, Christian, you mentioned this notion of sovereignty, and Denise, you as well. And there's no question that state sovereignty is a particularly important and live issue these days. And I think it really is necessary for us to have a stronger understanding of the relationship of the member states within the EU. And Denise, you touched on this as well about the role of France and perhaps the opportunity there for France to engage as a member of particularly of the Pacific and as a neighbour of Australia in a very real sense, with prosecuting the favourable outcome with the EU-Australia FTA. Now, Australia and the EU have concluded a framework agreement in 2018, which only came into effect in 2022. This is really it's almost like yesterday, for the purpose of understanding how Australia and the EU would relate to each other. But there's no question that the Indo-Pacific strategy of France, of the EU, and of the other member states is nevertheless implemented through the member states themselves. So in terms of the common elements that we see between what both Christian and Denise have outlined, we see that there is a strong collaboration and the opportunity for continued and better coordination of our policies and approaches in this region. What I think remains very clear from the questions that Christian was finishing up with and the observations that you were making, Denise, is that in fact, what we're going to unavoidably need is increased dialogue and conversation in understanding each party's position, understanding the pull factors as well as the push factors. And I think most particularly, it is necessary to coordinate the discussion of how, in a combined fashion, in this instance, Australia and France, but in a different forum, I would make the same observations in terms of Australia's relations with other member states of the EU. I think it is really important to understand how to coordinate for Australia, to understand how to coordinate with the member states of the EU to further both the interests bilaterally of the states in question, but also the relationship and maximising, benefiting from the EU's efforts to operate as a global actor. If I can just take a moment, and Frédéric, I'm very conscious of the time, and I don't want to take away from
a few minutes
discussion. It is important for us to understand that the EU exercises collective or pooled sovereignty when acting on the global stage, and that's no clearer than in the common foreign and security policy. And the Indo-Pacific strategies of the member states and of the EU move across both the exclusive competence of the EU, which is quite comfortable in the trade area, but then when we're moving into other areas where the EU it's not so mature and so developed, acting as a global actor, we see that there's much livelier engagement by the member states. But the fact remains that the member states operate as the European Council. They operate under the discipline of the European treaties, the Treaty on European Union most particularly, which is where we find the common foreign and security policy. I understand that it's not everybody's favourite topic to talk about law, but the fact remains that when we are moving into these arrangements, when we are looking at dialogue, when we're looking at ASEAN, we're looking at the Pacific Island Forum, we're looking at both regional and international arrangements, we are looking at them against the backdrop of treaties, of instruments which structure and shape the negotiations and the dialogue that is then undertaken. We need greater awareness on the ground, as well as at the governmental levels and among policymakers, of the nuance, of the complexity of these relationships and how we can actually advance them and support them at both the grassroots level as well as the governmental level. Because as things are developing now, it's not enough to have agreement at the international level, to have the states agreeing on their positions in these areas. If we cannot capture the minds and the understanding of our populations, and Christian, I think you touched on this at the beginning of your observations and comments. If we can't get our citizens working together and understanding this, then we're not going to succeed in furthering an understanding of what an Indo-Pacific strategy might be. understanding how we can ensure that it is a collective one that observes the principles which are embedded in these strategies, whether it's the France strategy, the EU strategy, or ideally the attitude that Australia may well develop in this regard. We need to recognise that we're working against a backdrop of the rule of law. We're working against a backdrop of efforts to ensure dignity, to ensure mobility and education, as well as trade. The security aspect is important, if not crucial, but there is so much more that is set out in these strategies, and most of that depends on the engagement, the operation of domestic communities, polities, the civil society, as well as the commercial enterprises as well. Now, for that to be effective and to function, it's necessary to feed down to the grassroots level. None of that happens quickly. And the diversity that both Christian and Denise have touched upon, both in terms of geography, in terms of the populations and the needs of the different communities and groups, is such that we necessarily have to work patiently and slowly and steadily. And that's why dialogue is crucial. It's not going to be something that will develop in a sense overnight, but it is crucial to be focusing on ensuring that we prosecute these relationships. And I can only concur with Denise that failing to mention France in the strategic review was, it's to be hoped, an egregious mistake, but nevertheless something that needs to be corrected sooner rather than later. Frédéric, I'm going to stop there. I hope that's been of some use, sort of throwing into the mix there, but foregrounding as well the importance, particularly for Australia, to understand the EU context as well as the member state context, and to promote the further bilateral engagement between our two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. We had three very rich presentations, not all on the same stage, but which opened a number of questions. And before we turn to the audience, let me remind you that you can write your question in the chat, and then we will relay them to the speakers. Apparently, among the questions which has been asked so far, there is most are directed to you, Christian. And the first one is about the not elephant in the room, because it's been addressed in Denise's presentation earlier. This is the role of the US. The question is about why France attends the Partners in the Blue Pacific as an observer and has refused to join the US-led partners.
Well, as you know, with the US, there is a different level of dialogue. In the last years, we established our own channel of dialogue with the US on Indo-Pacific and the Pacific regions. That's main evolutions. We define also a channel of discussion on these matters through the EU at the level of the EU Secretary General. That's why we have a regular dialogue with Americans on this matter at the macro level, when we are talking about the IP in broad terms, but also in some place around, especially you mentioned the Pacific island countries and territories. What we feel is when we are talking about the economic development of the regions, we have to work closely with the countries and territories. It's a kind of a triangular approach between the historical actors, US, France, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, newcomers, South Korea. In a certain sense, we can add Japan, but also Indonesia. They are playing a growing role to support the economic and social development in the regions. But also we have to take in consideration the Pacific Island countries and territories themselves. We observe there is some bilateral cooperation between Oceanian countries and territories. For example, even French Polynesia have their own development policy in the regions with the support of their own government, local authorities, NGOs, social actors. Exactly the same in New Caledonia. And I will also mention a territory like Wallis-et-Futuna. They developed their own cooperation with Fiji, Samoa, Tonga. Of course, is connected with geography, is connected with their cultural link, but it's very important. That's why if we define a common approach to create more synergy, we have to integrate the local actors, because if we don't do it, we will create a new Western club. And as I said, it's a risky approach. It will not be understood by the local actors. It will create suspicions inside and outside the regions. That's why from the beginning we insist on the inclusivity of this process. Of course, there is some countries more richer than the others, better organized to implement their ODA, have the capacity on the ground to inclement quickly as possible. That's why we are not against synergy, but we need this inclusive approach. That's why we repeat this message not only to Washington but also to the others major actors of the region. But as you mentioned, Frédéric, we are part of this process.
Thank you very much. We have a question which is addressed, I think, to both Christian and Denise, which is about precisely the terms of engagement of the Pacific Island. Climate change is increasingly seen as a defining terms in the relationship with the Pacific Island. And for understandable reason, Australia and France have different approaches to the issue. How is it likely to affect their cooperation in the Pacific? Let me start with you, Denise.
Well, climate change, of course, is the fundamental issue for the Pacific Islanders. It is the subject of the vast majority of the CROP group, that web of day-to-day working groups that exists under the umbrella of the Secretary for the Pacific Community, which was created immediately after the war, became the preeminent technical body in the Pacific. So Australia has, since its inception, been working on these issues with Pacific Island countries. Clearly, with the change of policy of the Albanese government on climate change issues, this has intensified. But certainly a number of those organisations are devoted to aspects, whether it be coral reef protection or monitoring sea level rises or special environmental programs or marine research and so on. And I think this is an area where working with France in the region has been extremely successful. And I would argue it's precisely because France has, in this context, tended to work within this network of organisations and agreements, showing respect for the region, for what has been established, and bringing its exceptional expertise in this area. And let it be said that the research organisations that France brings into French Polynesia and New Caledonia, Wallis and Futuna, are second to none. And I think the way we work together in the region is exemplary. So I think it's a very positive story, the cooperation of France and what France and Australia can bring to bear within the region in that area.
Before we turn to Christian, could you be a little more specific as how France and Australia has worked jointly in this regard on climate change in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, well, of course, SPREP is the environmental program, is one of the oldest of these working groups I'm referring to, groups that exist under the SPC, and France has worked within SPREP through its territories, which are full members, but also in providing funds through the SPC and through various coral reef programs and other areas of climate change. I think that's where it works most successfully.
And what was the role of Australia in it?
I beg your pardon?
And what was the role of Australia in it?
Australia has been there since its inception, contributing in all of these areas.
Christian, perhaps?
Sorry?
No, I was just asking Christian to answer the very same question on climate change and the way it affects the cooperation in the Pacific.
Well, I'm fully agree with what he said by Denise. The SPREP is the cornerstone on this dimension. And even in this perspective, we decided to open a new embassy in the regions in Samoa Island. I have no doubt that this Samoa Island embassy will work closely, even closer than with SPREP. SPC is the other element. That's why, in this perspective, we define a 5-year plan of cooperation with SPC, and this document was shared with our partners. Maybe in the near future, New Caledonia and French Polynesia will define even their own plan of actions, plan of actions. The last element on this question is our ministers decide to establish a specific agreement between the French overseas development agencies, Agence Française de Développement, and the McNaughton. They are working on these issues to define the objective, a project together, and even a common narrative. But we have, as Denise said earlier on, we have to take in consideration the small size of the administration of our partners. I think we need to provide more technicians on the ground to help them. We have to talk about how to facilitate the access to the budget. There is so many places to have budget at the EU level, member state level, but also the Green Fund and the multilateral different fund, and we have to support the administration to implement in concrete terms all this project.
Thank you. We have two questions which are quite similar, or at least complementary, and which are addressed to all three speakers. And this is about the role of NATO. What role should NATO play in the Indo-Pacific, and how could that complement what the EU can do? And France regards its territories in the Indo-Pacific region as French, and yet they are formally excluded from NATO guarantees in Article 5 and 6. Do you imagine in extremis there might be a broader interpretation of those clauses? So I don't know who wants to start on this. Let's start perhaps with you, and any idea on the way this could play out?
I confess that I rather think, Frédéric, you'd be better placed to answer that. And I think I will, on that particular one in terms of NATO and the EU, I think I will hand that to Christian and you and Denise, particularly because NATO falls outside my particular area of expertise. So I would prefer to do that if that's all right.
Christian, perhaps?
The importance of NATO, of course, is that it's the core of the Western Alliance. So I think the fact that some of its members, Germany and France specifically, have specific Indo-Pacific strategies, that's where it becomes important. But NATO is, of course, a grouping of countries with military and defense capacity. The territories of the Pacific are precisely that for France. They are their overseas territories. They are not independent. They have some devolved powers, but they do not have, they're not responsible for their own defence. France is responsible for their defence. So I guess you could argue, if you turn it round, that that France is the representative of NATO in the Indo-Pacific, and I guess that would boost the value of France to Australia as an Indo-Pacific partner. But the flip side of that is that France needs to manage, as I've referred to earlier, manage its sovereignty issues in the Pacific and Indian Ocean territories extremely carefully, because we do not, the last thing we want is that sources of instability and political and security threats arise from the French territories alone over sovereignty issues. And I guess this is why in much of my writing, I have as the cornerstone for France in looking at its participation in the Indo-Pacific as a NATO member, as a country with a large defence capacity, probably especially present in the region, that it needs to be very careful in the way it manages and helps the local people in its Pacific territories to achieve their aspirations. It's extremely important because, as Mr. Macron has indicated, the whole strategic basis of France's Indo-Pacific policy is sovereignty in the two oceans. If that sovereignty is lost, for example, through an independence declaration in French Polynesia or in New Caledonia, it will have implications for its other territories around the globe. So the fact that there is no defence capacity in these two islands, in these Pacific islands, is very important, very significant. And that's the difference between NATO and other activity in the Pacific.
And yet you will probably agree with me that the acronym NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, Christian, how can France reconcile, or is it willing to reconcile, or is it not willing to reconcile its presence in the Pacific with a treaty organization which concern mostly the North Atlantic?
Well, there is no doubt that the Indo-Pacific region interact with the Euro-Atlantic security. When North Korea decide to export arms and ammunition to Russia and use this armament and munitions on Ukraine, it creates an immediate linkage. The interactions between the Euro-Atlantic regions and China is growing not only in neighborhoods of NATO, but even in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. And we have to take in consideration this dimension. There is also a positive linkage. I mentioned the support of Australia in arms and munitions to Ukraine. We have a common project on these matters. We remember the price of blood of the Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Of course, I mentioned earlier on the World War I and the World War II in Europe. But that's why there is a strong and growing interaction, and we need to understand the evolutions, including the evolution on our U.S. allies, how they balance the capacity if there is more than one crisis in the same time in the world, will necessarily the engagement of the American support, American army. That's why talking about security, how to manage this security is important. But again, NATO is dedicated to the European security, and we are facing here a major challenge by the war of aggression of Ukraine. On the question of NATO and our territory, I answered earlier on these matters. New Caledonia and the French Polynesia were part of the Seattle until in the 1970s. And Manila Treaty was the roots of these dimensions. And of course, the absence of regional architecture since the mid-70s, it's a problem. But that's why we have to assume by ourselves, and we know that since decade, the sovereignty of our territory in the Pacific. And that's why we modernize our equipment deployed in the regions. We show our flexibility. We underline our capacity of action from France to the regions by deployment of air forces, navy on a regular basis, reinforce the air and sea dimensions in New Caledonia and French Polynesia. But how to develop military and security cooperation in the regions is important, not only in art security, but also in the police in dimensions. We are facing drug trafficking, growing in the regions, interactions with small and medium countries, development of other criminal activities. That's why when we are talking about security, it's not only the military dimensions, but we have also to take in consideration the other dimensions, even because some of our partners introduce new approach. Cultural security is also an element we have to take in considerations. Of course, it's running with a special noise in the French territory with multiple countries.
Thank you. Let's turn now for a little bit to the economic dimension of the relation. There is a question which basically says many Pacific nations are currently in the middle of a tug of war and at risk of economic influence. How can Australia and France work together to countering the economic coercion? And I would add, and that's a question coming from me, how can they actually play out their economic cooperation in a slightly more positive way? I mean, it's very striking to hear everybody talk about the excessive dependence vis-a-vis China, but miss every opportunity at diversification whenever they come from it. And of course, it's not a FTA which is going to change dramatically everything, but this is the way to go about things. It has been considered so far as sort of an acceptable way to do it. For a number of reasons, this is less and less so, but this is coming back in the debate now, and this is going to be probably a problem in the years to come. So how would you address this question of economic influence, both bilaterally and in and for the region? Would like to start on that.
I can start on that.
Yeah.
I think we need to be generous in our development cooperation and focused on areas where, obviously the best aid is aid that can help countries to help themselves. And I think the aid figures speak for themselves. The Australian government has stepped up its aid to the Pacific region in recent years, so has New Zealand, so has a number of other of the United States has increased its engagement. I think there is scope for France as a country present in the region, sovereign presence, resident in the region, to do a lot more than it's doing. At the moment, it spends 2 billion Australian dollars in each of French Polynesia and New Caledonia. Trying to get hold of statistics about how much it spends and gives to the rest of the region is a very murky task indeed. I've seen figures of 35 million, I've seen figures of 300 million, but no more than 300 million per annum, which is a very modest amount for a country that claims to be of the Pacific. So I would like to really say here that it's a matter of, first of all, being more generous, and secondly, focusing what we do squarely on economic production and economic projects which are going to help the countries to help themselves. Now, in this, I think Australia has worked for many, many decades to establish, as I've said, a number of groups and networks of organisations with the Pacific Island countries themselves. So there's plenty of, there's a whole range of organisations just under the umbrella of the Secretariat for the Pacific Community, but also flowing from other activity in the region where I think this aid can be very well directed.
But this is also true that in the French approach toward aid, there is a clearly very strong European dimension. So let me turn to you, Anne, and how would you consider that, reconsider that question through the European angle?
Look, I think there's considerable funding as well from the EU into the region. What I would say, though, regardless of where the funding comes from, if we don't also ensure that whatever the support that's provided is actually also on the ground, and by that I mean capacity building, focusing on strengthening the infrastructures, and I think education in particular, not only, but in particular is extremely important, because if you've got corruption in states and territories that is susceptible to whatever funding comes in, then it actually doesn't help those states and it doesn't help them develop, and it does enable particular interests, vested interests, to play states off against each other and exploit them. So in terms of the funding, the EU it's a considerable donor in this region. And once again, we have, I mean, for the EU, from its perspective as well, once again, because we're now talking about an entity of 27 member states, France has a very real interest in the area, understandably. Some of the other member states, the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, also have particular strategic interests. There are other member states, though, that are not so enamoured or do not see the pressure of supporting and developing either our region in the Pacific or, for that matter, the region in the Indian Ocean either. And so there's a challenge within the EU always to ensure that there is a recognition of the value of contributing and supporting within this Indo-Pacific strategy and within these regions. And it's why I think the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, strengthened through the Indo-Pacific strategies of states like France and the Netherlands and Germany, is important. But I keep going back, money is one thing and it's important and it's valuable, but if you do not have structures, for example, like Erasmus Plus with the EU and the Colombo program and other programs that support student exchange and development, that supports education and supports capacity building, particularly in government, transparency, accountability, then we have problems continuing to ensure that the sovereign states in the region are able to actually flourish. And we also have to recognise the reality that some of these states are actually never going to be enormous players. They're always going to be dependent on the largesse, I wouldn't say the largesse, but the other support that is provided elsewhere. And I'm thinking particularly of small island states like Nauru, Tuvalu, Niue, who are part of these in significant equal players in these, both in the forums such as the Pacific Island Forum. They're also facing the very real challenges that we were hearing about a little earlier in terms of climate change. And these states are not going to be taking the same position as Fiji, for example, or Papua New Guinea or Vanuatu or any of these other states within the region. So there's also that nuance that needs to be understood as well. So one size doesn't fit all. Christian mentioned absolutely having a strategy that ensures inclusivity and understands how those on the ground can be best served and encouraged and engaged. And that happens through the engagement of citizens, of communities, and it doesn't happen from a top-down approach only. It's necessary to have people on the ground, to have exchange, to have collaboration, to have understanding, support, and supporting people where they are to flourish and develop, rather than necessarily, for example, bringing them to Australia, training them up and sending them back, just as examples and observations. So in terms of the economic support and the push and pull between China and the US. I think rather than focusing on that binary, it is better to be doing, as Denise said, being generous and understanding the importance that contribution and support and being in the region. I am pleased to see that the Australian government is back supporting the communities and the states in this region in a way that it hasn't been doing as vigorously as it has done in the past. Conscious of the time there, so I'll just stop. But I hope that's gone some way to adding to that discussion. And I know Christian will have some really valuable insights as well.
Christian?
Well, there is a different level of cooperation between France and Australia on these economic matters. I think we can start by the Pacific island countries. Denise was totally right when she's saying it's a time for French Polynesia and New Caledonia to establish more economic connections with their own regions. There is different way to do it. The first one is to reach the regional organizations. That's why the private sector, the New Caledonian and French Polynesian, decided a few years ago to reach the PIPSO to discuss this matters. The other instrument is to organize on a regular basis some economic forum with the Pacific Island Forum, with the others actors. For example, a few years ago, French Polynesia organized an economic forum and invite Chile and Rapa Nui to discuss the tourism dimensions and the connectivity between Papere and Rapa Nui to develop common flight, even common project on the tourism industry. We have also to define some plan of actions with neighboring state. For example, New Caledonia is in the process to define an economic project list with Vanuatu and try to define a common approach on this matters. And finally, the New Caledonian office in Canberra, New Zealand, Vanuatu, Fiji, Papua New Guinea is also dedicated to develop this economic relationship, and we have to support this approach. And French Polynesia have some ideas to implement their own office in the regions, starting by Fiji. But when we're talking about economy, is three level of interaction at the level of small countries. I mentioned Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Between our territory and the most developed countries, Australia and New Zealand, but also the US. French Polynesia also look to North America, Hawaii, California, and Canada for different reasons. The second level of co-actions between France and Australia is to talk about the most sensitive issues, and I will see three. The first one is critical technology, even on the defense and security. We have in Australia and France some time to time the same company, worldwide company. And of course, their capacity to invest in a new technology are important in Australia and France. That's why it's very important to talk about this critical technology on the military field from under the sea to space. I mentioned the ammunitions, but there's also the maritime dimensions and on the space industry. The second dimension is the resilience change of values. We are facing a major revolution on this field, taking consideration more than in the past the centrality of ASEAN or few ASEAN member states. Can we enlarge this cooperation in common? It's a question mark. The third level is the connecting infrastructure. It's very important to invest in common, or to see what is the main infrastructure need at the micro and macro level. The Chinese do that, and they are very care on this matter. They develop a macro strategy. The Japanese have some ideas on this matter since a decade. Maybe between France and Australia, we have to discuss about this connecting infrastructure in the Pacific and then outside the Pacific, in Southeast Asia, how Southeast Asia is also connected to the West, the South Asia, and even the Middle East. That's why in my speech, I try to underline this dimension, how we will see the in-between on the European side and on the Australian side.
Thank you, Christian. Time is running very fast, and we just have a few minutes left. But I'd like to use this last time to stay a little bit on the commercial question, because this is one that you are carefully avoided so far. But if we look back at the COVID time, what it did highlight is the excessive dependence on China. Then now we ended up in the Indo-Pacific with interesting concepts such as the CPTPP, that the main contender, Australia, main ally, as you underline, Denise, refusing to sign and ratify, and therefore preventing access. On the other one, difficulty to sign any FTA between Australia and Europe, I was demonstrated 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this brings me to a question. If the commercial dimension of the Indo-Pacific was about diversification away from China, can we say today, and that's a provocative question asked to all of you, that trade is no longer an Indo-Pacific matter? Because whatever way you respond will have serious consequences one way or the other. Who would like to start on that? As a former commercial lawyer, and perhaps you could give us your first response.
So if I understand the question correctly, it's that if we're diversifying, we're moving away from China. Is that?
Partly, yes. At least you're diminishing the overall dependence, the part of the dependence.
Look, my own view is this. China is a very large and significant player in the world, and in the global economy, and in the region. So absolutely, it's important for states to diversify and to manage their relationships as best they can. I don't think it's realistic to consider that one moves away from China. I think what's more appropriate, and I think where we in the West and Australia could learn, is from the states in ASEAN to understand how we work with China and deal with China. Now, I might add that in a slightly different context, Australia has done quite well. Particularly, it's been very hard in terms of the sanctions that have been imposed on us in terms of wine and barley in particular. And yet, by not, dare I say, kowtowing, we've actually managed, despite the absorption of that hardship, the producers in Australia have still managed to diversify, to explore other markets. The simple fact of the matter is that China is such a large market that it's not realistic to try and I know you're not suggesting that we ignore it, but to not try and engage with it in a mature way. And similarly, I think China, the Communist Party, certainly needs to understand how to engage in a more nuanced and sophisticated way with the rest of the world. But we also have India as a significant market coming on board, and with a different model and a different political and legal system as well. So that I think what we actually all need to be able to do, and the Indo-Pacific strategy provides a valuable framework for like-minded entities, for like-minded states to work together in this regard. But it provides us with the opportunity to engage globally in a different way, but not to to try and exclude entities, states, parties, groups, however one might choose to use the language. So coming back to the Indo-Pacific, China is a part of the Indo-Pacific. We can't avoid that. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is, as it set out both the French guidance and the EU's policy, as well as those of the member states that have been adopting an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it is really valuable because it recognises the holistic approach there of the value, particularly in maritime sense, of these two oceans, and the importance of tying and connecting with Africa. So I'm not sure that that's actually answering your provocative question, Frédéric. I may well be trying to sidestep, and in one sense, I don't mean to, but I do think we need to move as a world. We need to move beyond these binaries, and we need to be able to push back where we see, behaviour that is not the sort of behaviour on the part of states. And we're focusing on China. All of us are aware of what's happening with Russia. But when we look at what's also happening with the US, and Denise touched on the significance of the US-Australia relationship, that's also cause for great concern here, given the development, politically speaking, at the minute that's occurring, to my mind, that's occurring in the US. So I think the value of something like the Indo-Pacific strategy is it reinforces the statements of principle, the statements of values, and I know there are other fora where one debates what that's meant, but I do think there's a sense that there's a general consensus of what we mean. And I think a litmus test is, would you like to be on the receiving end of behaviour that is being observed? And if the answer is no, then it's likely that you're sharing values with people who also wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of that. So I'll just stop there, but I just think we need to be able to move, if we're talking about a multipolar world or environment, and we're talking about geoeconomics and geopolitics, I do think we need to move beyond the somewhat calcified binaries that have tended to dominate the debates, even now in the 21st century.
The question was neither about binaries nor about mutual exclusivity, but nevertheless, Denise, your views on that.
My views are very much that China is here to stay, and that one of the best things we can do in the Pacific region is, together, France and Australia, is to direct our support to building good governance in the region, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in the Indian Ocean or in the Pacific. Good governance, because there is no doubt that the Chinese market's important. France's territories are dependent on it, so are all the Pacific independent governments. It's a matter of how one manages the demands, the conditions, the way in which other players come into these small markets. So if we can strengthen governance and strengthen capacity, then that's a good thing. And I think all of us need to realise this: China is a littoral of the Indo-Pacific. It is a littoral state of the Pacific Ocean. I know when it was first brought about, it was no secret I'm not a fan of the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and it's for that reason I think you have to include the players. We know it's geostrategically, it's a geostrategic message, it's a geostrategic concept designed to change behaviour. The reality is that China is and always will be a major player in the region, and it's a question of how we manage that.
Thank you. That still doesn't answer the trade question, but let's finish with...
Well, I think the trade question, it does, in the sense that we, in addition to making sure that we are strong economically, we need to make sure that our neighbours are strong in terms of governance and how they're running their trade policy.
But we need more than FTA narrative. We need really an economic narrative on in the Pacific strategy. and to define how we will implement this narrative in terms of ODA, in terms of investment, in terms of trade. In this perspective, also, we have to clarify one dimension, is the ASEAN centrality, especially in the perspective of the chain of values. We observe in the last years some move of investment and companies from China to Vietnam, to the Philippines, to in Indonesia. That's why, in terms of grouping, how we consider ASEAN as a central element of our common IP strategy. And last thing, I think I insist on this dimension is again connectivity, because the connectivity is changing by different way. The first change is created by the attitude of Russia in the last 2-3 years. Even in terms of connectivity, in the past, we mentioned the railways from China through Russia to reach Germany and France. We know the limit of this perspective in the time being. Even the Arctic route is another dimension today than in the last years. That's why the connectivity between the Middle East or West Asia and the rest of Asia will be important. And on this matters, when we're talking about connectivity, we're also talking about security, because in some place, the absence of connectivity, the main reason is because there is instability or even a major crisis. I was ambassador in Myanmar in the last 5 years. The present political military situation in Myanmar is a major obstacle of this connectivity between Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent, between Southeast Asia and mainland China, and even between India and China. And it's not the only place in the regions where there's absence of connectivity, because we are facing unstable countries and regions. That's why I mentioned earlier on the Eurasia and is an element of the game. That's why we have to think about in IP not as an island in the world, but connected with the rest of the world through Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, Latin America, and even some countries on the African coast.
Thank you very much for Christian. I mean, I'm not sure it is governance for trade, governance or trade, governance against trade. Nevertheless, this is not the question about only partly about trade. But I mean, unfortunately, we now have to bring this session to a close, and I wouldn't want to do it without thanking all of you very much for all the audience. It was a very lively and interesting conversation, and I hope the audience enjoyed it. I would also want to remind everybody, at least those being in Australia at the time, that the National Security College will be hosting its annual Securing Our Future conference on 9 and 10th of April in Canberra, and that all information are available on the NSC website. With those words, thank you very much again for your contribution. Thank you very much to the audience for the question and the participation, and see you at our next Indo-Pacific Partners at the end of April. Good evening.